I graduated from, as I say, graduated from high school, went to work in Philadelphia in the factories. You'll be interested in my first job, which my first 40-hour-a-week job was 30 cents an hour in the factory, $12 a week. Now, you people make $12 an hour today. But this was a full-time week work in a factory in Philadelphia.
But I was a college student when I went into the service. I was at the University of Scranton, which at that time was called St. Thomas College. And while I was there, they had a program for students to learn to fly at government expense, to have a pool of pilots the Air Force could draw from eventually. So during this program, I got all my pilot's license, a commercial license, while I was a student. And so I was prepared.
I ended up in the Marine Corps. It was very simple. I went to the Lancaster recruiting place. They had Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and I walked in and said, I'd like to join. The Air Force guy grabbed me. Hey, it was really great. This guy pulled me in, and he says, well, what do you want to do? I said, just want to get out of town. He says, okay. He says, you're not in any trouble, are you? No. And back in my day, by the way, everybody took, I shouldn't say everybody, it was very chauvinistic. All the males took the ASVAB test in high school. It was required. So they already had the testing done. So the Air Force guy tells me, hey, you'll be out of town in 2 weeks. And I'm going, all right. And I went away from there going, off we go. I was going to the Air Force, you know? And this Navy guy grabs me. He says, what did he tell you? I said, he told me I could be gone in 2 weeks. He said, we can have you gone in 2 weeks. I said, yeah, but he's in the Air Force. He says, think about this. He says, those planes, what keeps them up in the air? I said, I don't know. He says, they fall down. I said, yeah, they do. He says, you want to fall down? I said, no. He says, join the Navy. I said, okay. Sounds good to me. I don't want to do this. I don't fall down in airplanes. So I was thinking about, I was pretty sure I was going to join the Navy. Sounded pretty good to me. And this Army guy grabs me and says, son, what'd they tell you? And I said, well, I'll be out of town in 2 weeks. And I won't fall out of airplanes because I'll be in a boat. He says, boats sink. Yeah, they do. That's bad stuff. So he says, why don't you join the Army? I said, I want to join the Army. I want to join the Navy. He says, I can have you out of town in 10 days. I said, hey, that sounds good to me. I'll join the Army. So I went walking out there going, hey, caissons, go rolling. You know, I'm having a good time. And then there's this guy, and he's got this red stripe down his pants, pretty blue pants, nice khaki shirt. He says, son, get over here. And I said, yes, sir? He said, sign here. I said, what am I signing here for? He says, because I'm going to pick you up at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, and you'll be in Paris Island tomorrow afternoon. I said, Paris Island? This is a nice place. He said, hey, it's an island. It's got to be a great place. Sand, beaches, wonderful joint.
I was in Keystone Junior College from St. Mary's. I went to St. Mary's in Southside, South Scranton. And then I was in my freshman year in junior college. And what they did then at that time was the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and the Marines were coming into the schools and setting up desks and chairs for any one of the students that wanted to join up before they graduated. And quite a few of them on this freshman class in Keystone really signed up. That's one of the reasons why, yeah. My mother and dad, when I got home and told them I signed up, they walked out of the house. They couldn't believe that I had joined, you know. But anyway, after Keystone, I left because I figured I'm going to get in this quick and fast into this service. So I joined up. I joined the Air Force.
Where I worked in the city of Scranton, a friend of mine used to go with me, and every day at lunchtime we'd walk past the post office with all the posters. I know they had the finger pointing for the men, but they even have wave posters there saying, we need you too, and you can help, and all this stuff. So one day, my friend and I said, let's go in and talk to them anyway. So we went in, and it just sounded so inviting that we went in the next day and signed up.
I was in high school. Many of my friends were in the Guard at that time. And quite honestly, they convinced me to join the Guard. I had no idea what I was getting into. I joined a rifle company, an infantry unit. I am an infantryman by career. That means we walk with our feet, and we fight with our hands, and we get muddy and dirty and insect bitten, and it is not the most fun branch to be in the Army. And I've said many times that if I had the opportunity today to do it all over again, I'd probably be the best finance officer the Army ever had if I had a choice. But when I was a youngster, soldiers fought, as I saw it in all the war movies, and they raised flags on top of sand dunes, and, you know, the good guy got killed, or the bad guy got killed, or whatever, so I didn't know what I was getting into. But it was for adventure. And it's been very, very adventuresome for me. Over 42 years now.
This was quite an interesting experience. I'm at 21st Infantry, was formerly a National Guard outfit from Georgia. They were 52% illiterate. And this was kind of a shocking experience. In this cannon company, I had little experience, even trying to get moved into a tent in these Georgia boys. They assigned me to a tent. There were 3 people already in the tent. And you go to the supply tent, pick up cots, mattresses, and so forth, ready to move in. And I'll describe, we had a little difficulty because when I put a cot in there and went back and got a mattress, when I come back, the cot was out in the company street, which is in the sand. And so I had a little trouble getting moved in. I don't want to go into that. We got in but I thought maybe it was going to be a little trouble for me. But I went up to get my story into the first sergeant right away, and he just laughed and told me to kind of watch out for the boys. So that was quite comforting. I went back to the tent, and there was nobody in it. I got my stuff moved in. By this time it was dark. I laid on the cot with all my clothes on, and about 3 o'clock in the morning I heard feet coming down through the street. So I slipped out the back side of the tent, went over behind the next row of tents and lay down there. And I couldn't see, I don't know how many came in there, but they threw all my stuff out in the tent. I laid out there all night and waited till breakfast time in the morning. I went and picked my stuff up and put it back in the tent.
Got our training, and training was pretty much like any other boot training, except that we didn't do exactly the thing that the men do. Like, we didn't have to shoot the rifles and so forth. But it was a good there was a lot of physical exercise. You were up at 5:30 in the morning, run around the barracks, and the barracks is about as big as a school here, for instance, you know. So you ran around the barracks, you did calisthenics, or else you did exercises outside and so forth. Then you had to run in, get yourself dressed into this uniform, which, as you could see, is 50 years old. And you can see that I can't button it either. So we would get into the uniform, and then we would go and stand outside. You'd stand outside. Wherever you went, you marched. Hip, bop-a-reep, bop-a-reep, hip, hip.
Well, that was your
To eat, no matter where you went. And so boot camp, and then you would come back to you would eat. They march you back to the barracks. You'd have the police up around the area. Then you would go stand outside again. They would once again march you to wherever you were going, which sometimes was class. Most of the time it was maybe a 2-hour class or something like that. Then after class, you might have 2 hours of drill. Once more, hey, up-a-reep, hey, your left, right, left. Hey, that comes so natural to me.
I used to love the marching. I love that.
And so then we might have something like phys ed, and then we would go to lunch, and then we would come after phys ed. Though you always had to take a shower. This is funny. The showers. We had a shower room about half the size of this room with showers all around it like this. You dropped your clothes when you came in. The first person in would turn on all the showers as she was going through. By the time you got through, you were clean already. So everybody did the same thing. And then rush into your clothes again. Everything was really very, very rushed. And then maybe back to class again for 2 hours, or maybe on some sort of a field trip and so forth. We got back maybe about 6 o'clock again. Wherever you went during boot camp, you never went alone. You went in a group, you went in a platoon, and somebody was calling cadence for you. So
we were being part of what we called the killing machine. The objective was to get the enemy at all costs. So all the military does in the United States as any other nation. They look for conscription of persons who go to military service. Voluntary, if they don't get it voluntary enough, they automatically take you one by one, just like myself.
Last year of the war, I was assigned as personal pilot Field Marshal Montgomery of the British Army. He was the Commander-in-Chief of the British forces. So I was with him and his staff until the end of the war. Field Marshal Montgomery was the Commander-in-Chief of all British forces. And he was just the opposite of General Patton. General Patton, you've heard of, I'm sure. He was the man that carried silver, handgun or whatever you call it. And he was very macho. Field Marshal Montgomery was a teetotaler. He didn't smoke, and he was a man of high principles. And what little time I spent with him were very pleasant. He was a good man. He was I would say, a showman. He liked to be in the forefront of the news, but he had done, in the North African campaign, he had led his troops to quite an amazing victory there, going across all of North Africa to Egypt. But he was a very nice man to me.
The German guards that were with us in camp and on the march, we had nothing to eat. They didn't have anything to eat. You know what I mean? That's how bad it was. But the officers, now I'm talking about the general military attachments. The officers were great. The only ones that were trouble were the Gestapo. And the officers, no matter you were an enlisted man, a lieutenant is a lieutenant, an oberleutnant is a first lieutenant, a captain is a Hauptmann. These are all German. I don't know. You take German? Nobody takes German? No. They have German here? No, don't have German. All right. A Hauptmann is captain, then a Major is a major, and you keep going up till you get up to the general. The Gestapo they were the tormentors, and the officers that were in the camp, they didn't like them either. They were glad to they used to come into camp and just, like I told you, check around to see if everything was okay. But other than that, some of the German officers were okay.
Tropical country. When you get into Vietnam, it's very hot, it's very tropical, and the temperature there is constantly in the low 90s. So when we used to go out there, we used to wear our jungle fatigues, but we never wore any underwear under them. And the reason for that is that when it started to rain, it rained constantly, being in a forest jungle, what we now call rainforest area. It was constantly raining every day. Every day that I was over there, it actually rained for at least 1 hour a day. Anyway, what would happen is it'd rain, you'd get completely wet, but once the sun came out, you would dry off in about 10 minutes, that's all. That's how fast you could do it, just because your body heat would just take and just evaporate that water right out of it. And that was one of the worst things probably about being over in Vietnam, was the constant rain coming down.
1942, yay, the GIs came. They came to help us. The Japanese had done us a favor. They bombed Pearl Harbor. And that brought America into the war. Until then, America didn't want to get involved, naturally, but they came in 1942. And some funny things happened in the war. The first truckloads of GIs to come in were black. Now, we'd never seen a black person in our lives. We'd heard about your American Red Indians, so we figured they had to be American Red Indians. Their skin was brown. I mean, we knew American Indians were brown. So the first loads that came in were all American black people, men and women. And for about 3 weeks, they were treated like kings. I mean, we said, this is America's own people. These are the Indians. We must treat them like they're gods. So we did, and they lapped it up. They absolutely lapped it up. Then came in the white GIs, and they said, they're not American Indians, they're Negroes. And so their moment in the sun was was gone. I mean, we'd always treated all the Americans wonderfully, but, you know, so they had 3 weeks of being treated like gods. Till we figured out they weren't American Indians. But anyhow, with the GIs, they made a big difference to our lives. They not only helped fight the war and keep Hitler off our backs, but they brought, with their camps, they brought food, they brought medicine, and as kids, we went round to see the camp. I mean, there's thousands of GIs. They built an aerodrome, an airfield, and they were flying across the channel from the airfield. So us kids decided we'd go and have a look at these GIs, and there was thousands of them. And they were in big tin Nissen huts, big mess huts. And there they sat. They were all chubby and well-fed, you know. We were all hung up on being chubby and well-fed. And we saw this cook coming out and dumping food in the garbage cans. Well, we were appalled because they were dumping trays of steaks, they were dumping whole chickens, vegetables, and we couldn't understand this. And seeing they were going in the garbage can, we figured, well, they're throwing them away. So being the little one, got the job of climbing in the garbage can and throwing out the food. So we did this for about a week. And one day I'm in the bottom of this garbage can, flinging out chickens and steaks, and all of a sudden, I'm airborne. And this big guy says, "Hey, little lady, what are you doing in the garbage can?" And I said, "Oh, I'm not pinching them, mister. You chucked them away. I'm not stealing." Well, come to find out, they didn't realize that we needed that food. See, there was 5,000 men they were feeding. If you've got 100 steaks left or 100 chickens, you can't feed 5,000 men. So they threw them away. Well, that 100 chickens that was left over fed my village. So from that day on, they never threw anything away. They loaded up that food every day, and they came around the village, and we'd gather at the town hall, and they'd hand it out.
We get a weekend leave occasionally, and most of my time was spent in Bethesda. So a couple of girlfriends and myself would go into Washington, and I still haven't seen everything that's to be seen down there, even between then and now. And when I was in North Carolina, we used to go into the Rocky River, which is just a little town. You can make the rounds of the main street in about 5 minutes, I think. So that was about all we did. And then there were recreation rooms in our barracks that we just went down and fooled around. And there wasn't a lot of going on. Well, I'm trying to think, one of the places, there was a USO in the nearby town. I think it was in North Carolina. And we went there one night, but it was just really just to get out. There wasn't too much going on. There were some of the Marines from campers in the cave, and there was a little bit of dancing, but I didn't take part in that. I think that I don't know how I did what I did, because I was kind of laid back all the time. I never pushed to get into anything too much.
We played concerts. I played in a dance band, and we played dances for officers and so forth in towns in Tennessee. That's what the life of a bandsman was like.
We were in at Cape May. There wasn't much to do in the wintertime, so we went down to the big gym there with the Navy base and Coast Guard base. And we went down to the gym and we'd work out in the gym. So finally, the lieutenant in charge of the executive officer of the Coast Guard at Cape May was an avid basketball fan. And my buddy and I went down to the gym one time to work out, and Lieutenant Dane saw us, and he said, Lieutenant Dane, that sounds like your one movie, doesn't it, of what's his name? But this is different Dane. And so he says, I want you guys to play basketball for me. I said, we're on the 83-footer. He said, well, we can transfer you anytime you're ready. So sure enough, we got transferred, and all we had to do was play basketball. And here they are, the basketball players at Cape May, which turned out to be a championship team.
Yeah, we had movies. They showed movies in the mess deck because you couldn't show lights, of course. The doors were watertight when they were rigged so that when the door opened, the lights inside went out so that there was no light shining. I do remember when we were going from Okinawa to Japan, for the first time ever, we had movies topside. And I'm not much of a movie buff, but the other pharmacist with me, he was, and he just loved to go up there. I went up and looked when they were having the movies topside just to see what it looked like. And but they had movies and they trade them. You've seen episodes of MASH. Sometimes we didn't get what we wanted, but we got movies.
And an electrician in our town fixed up a big, it looked like a big ear outside so that we could hear without having to go out every few minutes to check in the bad weather. And you could hear people talking in town and slamming doors and dogs barking and everything else. But it was a simple matter of you had this certain code and number that you called in, which identified where you were, to New York. We phoned into New York. And you would tell them whether it had one engine, two engines, the direction it was coming from, the direction it was going, approximately how high it was, whether it was low, medium, or very high. Even if you couldn't see it, you reported it. And they plotted it on a map, and of course so we knew when the regular ones went over the mail planes and the regular ones, you were ready for them because they came, and once in a while they'd send one through to test you to see if you were awake, like at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they'd come over with a military plane or something for you to report. And it was right in back of our house. My mother was the one that organized the groups of people. Of course, we're on a farm, in a farming area, and naturally everybody had to be up to get the cows milked and so on. So people had to leave like at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'd go up and watch until school started, and then I'd be back up there during supper hour milking at night, and quite often all night, and particularly in the summer during haying season. I couldn't live up there because there wasn't anybody else. My mother was working, my father was working, and I was too young to work, so that was my job, and that was basically it. I always felt it was worthwhile, but I never thought it was too terribly important because nothing exciting ever happened. It's really rather boring sometimes, but I guess it was important.
The war broke out. All the women, their husbands were half of them in the service. They all got jobs, and they were called Rosie the Riveter. They worked in planes, they worked in factories. During the summer, like we would get a job, I was only ninth grade, and you'd work in an army place making the chevrons for the soldiers, just to help with the war effort. Like I told you, we were all here, and it was a tough time for us too. I mean, we were young, but the other ones, I felt bad for them. Like the blackouts that I told you, the siren would blow, no matter where you were, lights went out, total darkness, and I remember my sister and I were on Main Avenue, and we had to run home in the dark, feeling our way, because if there was no moon out, forget it. It was just dark, running home. And like I said, when they blow the siren and they say lights out, if you were home, the lights had to be out. That was it.
During the war, there were Gold Star mothers, mothers of sons and daughters who were killed in the war. The government issued to them, I told you it was a cardboard, but it wasn't. It was a white satin flag with a red and blue border and a star on the flag for a son or a daughter who had been killed. And they hung them in their windows. Imagine how you'd feel if you went by a house and saw 7 gold stars on a flag. There was such a family, not around here. Their name was Sullivan. They had 7 sons, and when they enlisted in the Navy, they asked to all be assigned to the same ship. They were, and the ship was sunk.
As the train was pulling out of Waterloo Station, a young mother came running along the station with a newborn in her arms. In those days, they kept you in the hospital for 10 days, and she just got out of hospital. And she handed this baby boy through the window to my mother and said to her, "Please take him with you. If he stays here, he'll die." So we took this baby boy. We didn't know this woman. She gave us her name and address and a bundle of clothes and a can of dry formula, and we took him with us. Well, his name was Kenny, and my brother's name was Kenny. And for 5.5 years, we raised 2 Kennys. And my mum made sure that that little boy knew. He called my mum Auntie Anne. And we let him know he had a mother. And she would come and visit whenever she could. And a funny story is, many years after the war, we lost track of Kenny. We gave him back when the war was over. And we lost track of him. And we were living in a house called Oval Way. And round the back of our house was a grove called Kennington Grove, and it was a dead end, and you had to come round Kennington Grove and go past our house to get to the main road. And my mother said to me one day, "There's a new family moved in around Kennington Grove." I said, "Boy, that woman looks familiar, but I can't place who she is." So she says, she's got a big boy with her, and he looks familiar, but I can't place him. Anyhow, one day my mum was outside shaking the rugs, and this woman and the boy went by, and all of a sudden my mother looked at him, and he looked at my mum, and he said, "Auntie Anne!" And she said, "Kenny!" 15 years later.
Anyway, we were at Griffith Stadium Sunday afternoon, and all during the game we kept hearing, "Will General so-and-so report to his office? Will Admiral so-and-so report to his desk?" And we didn't know what was happening. Nobody said anything other than they were calling out all these major service people. I don't remember who won the game, but anyway, after the game was over, we went out to the car and heard on the radio that the Japanese had invaded Pearl Harbor. So we, first thing we wanted to do was go out and see the Japanese embassy. Well, you couldn't get near it. They had troops all around it, and you couldn't get near the place. They were burning some of their records already. If you think of the timing now, the invasion was Sunday morning early, right around daybreak. And here we are 7 to 8 hours later in the game in Washington, D.C. So anyway, we drove home that night. The next morning, all 6 of us went and enlisted in something.
Then after we were shot down, we bailed out. We were at 31,000 feet, and when we were hit, that's when I found out later on that my pilot, incidentally, my pilot was First Lieutenant Joe Young. He was 20 years old, the youngest pilot in the squadron. We got hit, and we knew we were going to go down. So the co-pilot come back and said, "We're going to have to bail out." So they opened the bomb bay doors, and one by one we went out. And my engineer was the last one out. And we landed in a cornfield right outside of the town of Vienna. And I ran across him. I would have been gone, I think. Maybe I could have got back to an area where there was nobody. But he was laying on the ground, my engineer, and he was hit pretty bad. So I stayed with him. About a half an hour sat with him, wrapped a parachute around his leg. And about 20 minutes later, the civilian, like the National Guard, we could hear them. They were coming up, and they come up with trucks, put us in the truck, and took us to camp. And that's where I spent 15 months in POW camp, way up near the Baltic Sea. up near a town called Stettin.
And we went to a little village called Hillersleben, okay? And what happened in that area was one of the most infamous concentration camps in Germany was called Bergen-Belsen, okay? Thousands and thousands of people were executed or destroyed. But for some unknown reason, they had loaded up this train, and they were taking these concentration victims somewhere in Germany. I have no idea. It was never proven where. But our troops were advancing so rapidly that they abandoned this train. There were 2,400 concentration victims on the train. Men, women, and small children, how well I remember. And we had to go down where the train was and unload these people. They were living skeletons. You've probably seen pictures, as I mentioned, or as I refer to them as skin and bones, and I'm not saying that in any disrespectful manner. But we had to unload these, remove them from the train. It was a horrible sight, believe me, a very horrible sight. That thing will stay with me forever, too. And we set up our tents. We had large war tents. The war tent was as long as this room, really. And, well, they weren't. They were probably as wide as where this young girl was sitting. And we used to line the cots on each side, and we called them war tents. Of course, we had a big Red Cross logo on each side, you know, for protection, hopefully. But we set up a bunch of those, and we had to receive special shots, like for typhus and things like that. We had to wear masks at all times. It was difficult to try, and we could, and once we got them off the train, it was difficult, you know, to transport them any other place because of their rundown condition. And you couldn't give these people whole food, as we would, like pizza, you name it, you know, anything, because they would actually, and I'm not a doctor, but by trying to eat this type of, you know, solid food, as we say, they would actually kill themselves, really. So we had to feed them intravenously, you know, like this, which was a difficult thing because trying to find a vein was an awesome task. And of course I had to do these things as a technician. And I remember they would be screaming, you know, bloody murder, excuse the expression. But it was a difficult thing. And in fact, the first night, we lost 44. You know, I remember those figures. We lost 44 that died, you know. And we treated those unfortunate individuals for about 3 weeks before we could actually, you know, transport them to what we call an evacuation hospital or to a general hospital, which was still in the field, you know, basically tents and things like that. But that will stay with me forever.
There were some people whom I did interview at the camp. One was a father and a son. Now, this is an enlargement of the picture of the son, who at that time was 4 years old. And the father told me a rather bizarre story. To be frank, at the time was pretty hard to believe, because he told me that when his wife, his son, and he were being rounded up to be transferred to a camp, the mother, fearful that if the son would be with her, that the both of them would be killed. And so she put him in a sack and handed him to her husband. And the both of these wound up in a camp, and they were transferred to Buchenwald concentration camp. And he became known as the Benjamin of Buchenwald. Now, Benjamin is a Jewish word for Benjamin. You'll recall that Benjamin was the youngest son of the patriarch Jacob. And in many Jewish families, the youngest son is called the Benjamin of the family. And he, being the youngest at Buchenwald at the time, was known as the Benjamin of Buchenwald. And later, his father and he found their way to Dachau, and that's where I interviewed them. Now, I do have a number of my pictures in different museums. At the conference, at the Wannsee Conference Hall in Munich, the Jewish Museum in Paris, Imperial War College in London, and also at the U.S. Holocaust and Jewish War Veterans Museum in Washington. And I've been asked many times if I knew where this boy was, what he was doing, what his name was, and I was curious. And so I wrote to New York, where there is a group of survivors, if they knew of his whereabouts. And the response I got was that he wasn't on their roll. Well, last summer, a group from New York went to the Jewish War Veterans Museum, and one man walked over to his picture and said, "I know that boy." And the curator got very excited because he knew that I was interested in knowing about this boy, and of course so was he. And so he got his name and address, and he contacted him, and he promised that he would come to Washington to view the exhibit. And then he called me and asked if I wanted to see him again. I said, of course I would. And so my wife and I made a trip to Washington, where we met him. First it was at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, then the next day at the Jewish War Veterans Museum. Now, he was no longer 4 years old, of course, but he was in his 50s. And while we were at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, Mrs. Thibault, the lady whom you're going to meet in Washington, was with us, and she had the influence to ask the guard for permission to remain in the museum after everyone else had left. And that was granted. So here we have a picture of this man whose name was not Benjamin, but his name was Joseph Schleifstein. And he was able to look at an audio video, and these were pictures of people who were liberated from concentration camps. So this is a picture of this man looking at the picture of a little boy who was liberated, and that little boy happened to be him. And there's a long period of silence because we knew that he was thinking of many things.
Food was at its lowest ebb. There was no meat coming in at all. And so in the spring of 44, they brought us in whale meat. They were killing whales and bringing in whale meat. It was greasy and it was oily, but my mum was a genius with a bit of whale meat. By the time she soaked the oil out and fried it up with some onions, it went down pretty good. Well, that ran out after a while, so then they brought in horse meat, and same sort of thing. She could doctor that up and you could get that down. But the lowest ebb was Christmas time of 1944. Because the word went through the village that they were bringing in reindeer meat from Black Plains. Now, my mum and all the adults are all lovely. A bit of venison, they were really had their mouths set for that. But I'm telling you, I was a child, so I thought like a child. And it wasn't lovely to me, and it wasn't lovely to the rest of the kids in the village, because in our minds, Hitler was playing the dirtiest trick of all. We were gonna have to eat the reindeer, and that meant without the reindeer, Father Christmas couldn't come to us. We figured Hitler had really figured this one out to get us. We could take all the bombs and everything he threw at us, but don't take Santa Claus, Father Christmas away. So we were all pretty sick and upset about this, because how the heck can Father Christmas come if there's no reindeer to pull the sleighs? So we went to bed on Christmas Eve, figuring there's no Father Christmas. There's just not going to be any Christmas. So you can imagine my surprise, can't you, on Christmas morning, when in my stocking sat this little bear. Now, I always wanted a little bear in red velvet trousers. He had suspenders at one time, and he was much prettier. But as you can see, he got loved an awful lot, and lost a leg from my brother and I fighting over him, and I stitched him back together. So he was in my stocking on Christmas Day. And from that day on, I have realized there's always a silver lining. It doesn't matter how bad things get. They're never as bad as you think they are. There's always a silver lining. And even many years later, when I found out that my poor dad had dodged bombs, he was in Coventry, my father, and Coventry took a heck of a beating. It got bombed as bad as London did. And my dad searched high and low and dodged all kinds of bombs to find that little bear. It never diminished my faith in Father Christmas, because between Father Christmas and the magic our parents can pull off, I got my bear. And Hitler didn't win.
I arrived in England. I was sent to a replacement depot, and I was assigned to the 1st Division. My job with the 1st Division was to, again, retrain some more on the machine gun, the mortar, and the rifle. We did that from February 1943 until June 6, 1944. Then D-Day came. June 6, 1944. The end of the world came that day if you were on the beach of Normandy. 250,000 men were put ashore in an area of 10 miles. It's a sight you'll never forget if you were there.
We were out there when the bomb was dropped. And that was an interesting time. Because a lot of people say we never should drop the bombs on the Japanese. I would argue that with you any time you want to argue. There were so many of us out there, and we were so powerful that in another month we would have invaded Japan, and Japan wouldn't exist today. It would not exist at all. We might have lost some troops, we might have lost some fires and things of that nature, but we were so powerful it couldn't have happened. Nothing. So it had to happen that way, even though Nagasaki and Hiroshima were destroyed. They would have been there anyway had we gone in.
If we had invaded Japan, the casualties would probably have been in excess of 500,000. The Japanese casualties would have been probably at least twice that number. At Nagasaki, I think there were about 80,000 people killed. In Hiroshima, maybe a few more. A couple 100,000 total. Compare that with the millions that would have been lost otherwise, even for the Japanese. And it comes out plus. Yes, another thing too, I still feel this way. If you're in a war, you win it. And if you gotta use an atomic bomb to win it, you use it.
Interesting ones was one time in a major, as is happening, current crisis, I was plotting aircraft movement on these big maps that you see, plotting them on there. and I had like 2 generals and 3 colonels and Lord knows how many civilian big shots standing over my shoulder watching as this is happening. And it was lunchtime, and nothing stops me from eating my lunch. So I pull out my peanut butter and jelly sandwich with a chunky peanut butter, and I'm eating it and doing this at the same time, and I had a major chunk of peanut butter drop on the map, like right over Beijing, China. And when the brass got a little excited because they thought that was a plot that we'd have a plane overfly China. And I said, it's just peanut butter.
I was a P-47 pilot and a fighter pilot, and I went to Tuxford, England. That's where I was stationed. And the interesting thing is that I only had 2 missions because I had a prop go out. I'd had a propeller. The P-47 had an electrically controlled propeller, so when you advanced the throttle, the braid would change pitch and you get more thrust without the same revolutions. But it was very inefficient. They eventually changed it over to the Hampton Standard, which was hydraulically controlled, more efficient. But during the time we had that, they lost a lot of planes, and just from malfunction like that. And I had bailed out of one over the Okefenokee Swamp down in Florida because of the prop had gone out, and I couldn't land in the swamp, so I was familiar with it. But I had a prop go out over the Belgian border at 30,000 feet. And my squadron went on. I was in a group of 48 fighter planes that we were escorting bombers into Germany, and they were going to bomb German airfields. And our job was to attack any German aircraft and to drive them off and try to shoot them down, of course. Over the Belgian border, my prop went out, and I had to drop out of formation. And that, my squadron went on. Wartime, you're expendable. You expect that. I knew that. I accepted it. So my squadron goes on, and I'm left alone with the Focke-Wulf sitting above me in a superior position. He said up here, at 3,000 feet above me, which is the ideal position to attack. That you always try to get above the enemy and attack him. So I was without power, deep over enemy territory, and alone with the Focke-Wulf. And I couldn't maneuver because I didn't have power. And I had to escape it. And so that was my first challenge. And I managed to do it. But I had to bait him into attacking me. I had to outwit him, in other words, in order to escape. And I shouldn't take a lot of time on that, but the way I did it anyway was I pretended I didn't see him, because I knew that if I dove away from him with power, he'd be right on me quick, and he'd shoot me down. And so I wanted to find a way to dive away from him, because my plane could outdive his without him getting a good shot at me. So what I did is, I just pretended I didn't see him, because I wanted to bait him into coming back and attacking me. So he'd get a lot of speed, because with a lot of speed, it took him longer to turn. He'd keep picking up speed all the time. And he would reach the limit of the speed on his plane. And besides, while he was making that big turn, I'd be going straight down, which I did. And I waited until he was ready to fire. As a pilot, you know all about firing on another plane. And I waited till he came down, and I saw him adjust his nose a little bit, and I knew he was about ready to fire. And I waited still a couple seconds, because split timing was the only way I could escape him. I mean, split second timing. And so when he was about ready to fire, I flipped it and went straight down, and he was firing at that time. And then he wavered, and he down after me. But by the time he caught up with me, got his nose on me, I had dove about 5,000 feet, picked up to about 500 or 600 miles an hour, and he couldn't stay in a dive. He had to pull out of it. He just brought his nose around on me, and I was ready to take evasive action, and he had to pull out because his plane wouldn't stand the speed of mine. I knew that. You have to know, like all combat, it's like knowing your own, what you do out in life. You know your strengths and what you can do with them. And in wartime, of course, you know the weaknesses of the enemy's plane and his weaknesses. And I knew that my plane could outdive his, and that was the only strength I had at that point and at that time. So I did. I managed to lose him. But that put me into speed of sound dive, and this is before Chuck Yeager broke the speed of sound. Later on in 1947, because that plane would do that. That was a World War II plane that would fly through the speed of sound and survive. And I picked up to 700 miles an hour going straight down. I went through the shock wave, and the controls froze. And those planes weren't designed to pull out of a high-speed dive. They hadn't gone that far yet. And the theory was that when you got into an uncontrolled dive and the controls froze, push the stick forward. Now, you know what that does when you're flying along the lever. Push the stick forward and the nose goes down, doesn't it? Your nose right in. Well, when you're diving, you push the stick forward, you just go back under in a steeper dive. So it's against what you want to do, see. But after, when I couldn't pull it out, and I braced my feet, and I rolled the trim tabs back, and I won't explain all that. And I couldn't pull out the dive, of course. I pushed the stick all the way forward, because I was down to about 20,000 feet then. I was doing 700 mile an hour by that time. Straight down, which is about 1,000 feet a second. So that's about 20 seconds from impact. And when the controls you can't pull out, you got to do something fairly fast. So I remembered the instructions to reverse controls, and I pushed the stick all the way forward, and I held it, or I could feel pressure on it. It's something you don't want to do, but you do it when you're in an emergency. And I held it there, and pretty soon I felt the nose of the plane move out and pulled out the dive. But the speed was so great that when I pulled out the dive, you black out, you're used to that. And a fighter pilot, he'll pull it in a tight turn, and centrifugal force will pull the blood down from his head. And the net effect is you can't see, you're conscious, but you begin to fade out. You're aware of it. And what you do is you let up on the stick a little bit so you can still see, so you can stay with your opponent. And a good test of a fighter pilot was to be able to do that at the most degree and not black out easy. But with this high-speed dive at 700 mile an hour, and when I pulled out of it, I had no control over it. I lost total control of the plane because I was pushed down to sea. You can't move a muscle. You can't, my mouth was open, I couldn't close it, you couldn't raise a finger, you couldn't do anything. You're just like tons of pressure on you. And you can't even breathe. And the plane pulled out on itself once I started it. But I went totally unconscious. And when I came back to, I was up at 18,000 feet. I was standing on its tail, and I still had about 105 mile an hour. And that's without power. I drove from close to 30 down to 12, and there was enough centrifugal speed there as a plane to take me back up to 18,000. Standing on its tail, I still had, the P-47 stalled out at about 100 mile an hour. 95 if you're empty, 110 if you're loaded with fuel on the ground. That's when you drop on the ground. So this was right at that stall speed, ready to drop back on its tail and spin. That's when I come back to consciousness, and I managed to nurse it over on this left wing and fly it. I don't want to take a lot of time. I had another, then I went down. I thought I'd lost the Focke-Wulf, but then I didn't know whether I was over Belgium or over France, so I let down a little further, and it was still without power. And I saw a hole in the cloud down at 12,000 feet, and I wanted to see if I could pick up a landmark. All the fighter pilots and all pilots in World War II are instrument rated, meaning that we fly in weather. And over Europe, it was all cloudy. So after I took off from the airfield in England, I hadn't seen any of the ground at all. So through all of this, we're up and it's all hazy. You can see a little horizon, you know where up and down is, but you're up in a big hazy world and you don't see the ground underneath you. So I was near the Belgian border, but I wanted to know where I was. So I saw this little hole in the clouds about 12,000 feet, and I thought I'll just glide. I was gliding without power. I'll glide out over it, and maybe I'll see a landmark. And I glided out over this cloud, and immediately I would look down. I was right on top of a Messerschmitt field, a German airfield, south of Arras. I think it was their headquarters airfield, because I've read since then that their main field was south of Arras. And it was, all I could see was the airfield, and it was loaded with Messerschmitts. And immediately they shot flak at me. I could see it right in front of me in this hole in the clouds, and bang, 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 and then it hit right under the nose of my plane. I don't have a picture of my plane here. But because it hit under the nose, the plane took the shock and it set it on fire, but it didn't hit me. I didn't know at the time. I wasn't sure whether I'd been hit or not, myself personally. There was just a big explosion, and there was flame all around the plane and the whole bit. But I didn't want to bail out there because I was right over a German airfield, and I knew I'd be captured. And I also, as much as the German fighter pilots and American pilots, both fighter and bomber, had what they call a code of honor, that we wouldn't shoot down an enemy once he was out in his parachute. The ground crew might use me for practice on the way down. The soldiers on the ground were more likely to shoot you. on the way down, and if you got out of your plane, you'd be safer than the pilots in the air. So I didn't want to come down. I thought they might use me for target practice there. I wanted to stay with my plane. So what I did is I dove right back to cloud cover quickly, and I couldn't see. There was smoke and flame, and I thought the thing was going to blow up on me, but I decided to stay despite that. There was little decisions of what save you when you get through. It's the only way I escaped. If you read my book, you'll see time after time I made the right decision somehow. My training, my instincts, my reflexes, whatever it was, each time I was thinking. You think through the situation. You aren't in a situation where you suddenly get fearful and you just don't know what to do. You're always thinking of what you've got to do to save yourself. And I skidded it, and I managed to get the flames out. But then I knew that the Messerschmitts would be right after me in a hurry, and I had to get on the ground in a hurry. And I saw a cloud layer down to 4,000 feet, and I dove down to that, and I planned to use that as cover for any planes coming up from the ground. I knew they'd be right after me. And then bail out, and at that point go on down in my parachute. Because, as I said in my book, I knew that if you're in your plane, you're still fair game. And if I went down and tried to make a forced landing, there was open fields under me once I got down below 8,000 where I could see them. But if you go in and try to land, you're still fair game for the German pilots. And they were for us. In other words, you shoot a plane as long as it's in the air. So I knew if I was down, and if you've ever flown an FB, you know, once you get consigned to your approach and you're low to the ground without power, there's nothing you can do. You just sit there and you're shot down. So I was aware of that. So I decided to bail out. And I went down, slowed up, and I bailed out, and I got caught on my plane. That went up something. I had one thing right after another all the way down. And I got caught on the side of my plane by one of the, there's two straps that come over here, and they hook into a belt that goes around you to hold you in the safety harness. And you pull this lever, and it releases them. But one of those straps had got in my parachute harness somehow. So when I went over the side of the plane, I was slammed against the side of the plane on the right side, and I was caught to it. And I remained there caught. All fighter pilots, we had a hunting knife we were supposed to carry, but I was big for a fighter pilot. Most fighter pilots were shorter and smaller because the planes weren't that big. And I was 6 foot, 180 pounds, so I was a little bit big for a fighter pilot. So I didn't wear the knife. I left it back in the barracks. And now I grabbed for this knife, and it's not there. I cut myself free. And then I tried to pull myself back in the plane. And the plane, of course, moved over and started to the ground. The air pressure was too great. I couldn't do that. So finally, it looked like I was a goner. I could see the spot on the ground. I was bent, caught in the middle. I was bent back. My top was bent back, and my feet were bent back. And I could look down my nose, right on the nose of the plane, and see right where it was going to hit the ground. And I knew that there was only a second or two left, and I pushed with all my strength on the thing that was holding me, and I come free somehow. Opened my chute, but I was so low to the ground that I only swung out once and back, and I hit the ground hard. And I hit the ground so hard that I was numb all over. I couldn't feel anything. I didn't know whether I'd broken my back or not. But I landed, fortunately, in an open field where the ground was soft, and I bounced. As I said in my book, it was interesting that I bounced 3 or 4 feet in the air when I hit. And it was an illusion. I remember out of the corner of my eye, I could see the horizon going up and down. It was like being suspended in space, and the Earth is bumping you, see. It's sort of an illusion there. Anyway, then I was on the ground, and immediately a Messerschmitt was right after me from the field. As soon as I hit the ground, I looked and I saw him coming. And without a lot more detail here, because you may want to ask some questions, I managed to scramble, get my chute, and I hid in a little metal patch while he searched for me. And then when he went away, I hid in a beet field. The Germans came soon after, and they searched the beet field, but didn't find me, because I hid, and they didn't search it carefully. I didn't think I could hide there, and they didn't either. And then I hid in the haymow, and then the underground helped me out. I had a lot of close calls going across France. I come down way up to a little town, Herveliers and Saint-Laguerre, and up in northern France, next to Bapaume. I hid out in Bapaume for 2 weeks, way up in northeastern France, south of Lille, northeast of Paris. And so to get out, you couldn't go across the channel because the Germans were expecting the attack by the British and Americans on Europe, and they had that heavily fortified. So to get out, I had to go all the way down across France, through the Pyrenees Mountains. Spent a week there without food, almost on death, or thought we were. And I had an infected foot there and another problem going through the mountains. And then across Spain and back to England.
And what happened is a typhoon came through. And we were stuck up there for almost a week and a half, but we only had enough food for 3 days. So for the last 4 days, we didn't have any food at all. And when you hear these stories about starving people in country, it's not only until you've been able to see this and also to experience this. You know what it's like? You would almost sleep all day long because you didn't have any strength. And even when you had to get up and go to the bathroom and all that, you'd start to feel a little bit woozy from not eating anything. But finally, this typhoon passed in and they were able to rescue us. We couldn't get out by helicopter because it was so overcast, and we couldn't walk out because these two rivers were just swollen and we couldn't get out there. So we were just stuck up there for almost a week and a half. And that's one of the memories of Vietnam that I'd like to leave behind.
My recon team, Darrell and the others, we had been on R&R in Hong Kong. It's a different story. We came back and the officer had taken the team out. And they were supposed to be shadowing a North Vietnamese regiment, which is about close to 1,200 people, bad guys. And there were 16 of them out there supposedly shadowing them. Well, the officer was basically worthless, and he screwed up. And instead of shadowing him, he got inside of them. So instead of staying on the outside, they were all around him, and he had to move along with the regiment. So as senior sergeant, when we came back from Hong Kong, they tried to sober us up as quickly as possible, and they did. They put us on oxygen, gave us epinephrine, which really clears your head real fast. Whoa, I'm straight. And we packed up and we went out. And we got out in the general area of the 5-man recon team, and through radio, it took us close to a day and a half to work our way through the bad guys and into where this lieutenant was. And Darrell and I got in about dusk, and Harris is saying a few dirty words about the lieutenant, and little Timmy Fonderland isn't too happy with this clown either. And we get in there, and everybody's going, okay, you know, this is good. Senior sergeant's here, first team's here. All right, we're going to get out of this. So a lieutenant comes up, and the first thing he says is, okay, Sergeant, you ready to move out? And I said, no, sir. He says, what do you mean, no, sir? I said, stuff, sir, I'm not moving out. And he says, I'm lieutenant here, we're going to move out. I said, no, we're not. Now, you got to understand something here. We're in a very heavily booby-trapped area, and we're in the middle of bad guys. Okay, now that doesn't mean much to you, but to me it means a lot. I can move through bad guys at night, no problem. You walk in a half crouch, you take slow steps, you sniff, your eyes don't pick up much, but your ears do. And when you hear things, you pinpoint them and you move around them and so forth. You can do that. I can do it. Or I can move through booby traps at night. It's no big deal. You get down on your hands and knees or flatten your stomach, and you crawl along feeling forward looking for tripwires and things. But notice the difference. One, you're on your feet. The other, you're on your hands and knees. I can't do both at the same time. So I tried to explain this to this fool, and he didn't buy it. He ordered us to move out. And I was not really in a good mood at that time. I was still kind of hung over, and my head was going boom, boom, boom. And this idiot's going to get me killed, and that kind of bothered me. I'm, not really partial to people trying to kill me. And moving out at night was a stupid thing to do. So I started choking him. Seemed like the thing to do at the time, and we were down the ground, and I said, he wasn't real happy. And then Darrell grabbed me and said, let's go. And I said, no. He said, let's go. And I said, no, somebody's going to get killed. And he said, let's go. And I said, no. And he turned and walked into the bush. Well, if you know buddies and you know Vietnam and you know things, if your buddy goes into the bush, you go with him. And I followed. We made it about 50 meters, and I found out in 1991 when I met Darrell that he's the one that tripped the booby trap because he was on point and I was behind him. Said to him, well, why wasn't I on point? In an area like that, I'd usually be on point. He says, oh, you were too hot to be on point. He just walked right along. And it's like, okay, that sounds like me. Well, he apparently tripped it, and the way booby traps are set up, very often they're not set up to get the guy that trips them, because that's usually somebody got on point that's expendable. You know, it's cannon fodder up there on point. So you want to get somebody, a couple people back, because that's where the officers are, the senior sergeants. So when the thing went off and hit my right side and got Darrell and got Denny Thompson behind me, all I can tell you is it felt like, you ever hit the baseball out, throw it up and you hit it out, you know what I mean? Okay, I was the baseball and God had the bat, right? Because it, bam, it just slammed into my right side. I remember, and the stories are true, because I remember it very well, there was just this brilliant white light, and so warm and comfortable, and I remember thinking very clearly, so this is what it's like being dead. You know, this isn't so bad, it's comfortable, I don't hurt, feel pretty good. And then all of a sudden, zap, I was back into real time, and I was lying there, and the guys were busting off some flares because the bad guys were hitting us then. So I must have been out 2-3 minutes, and this leg was in bad shape. This leg was in bad shape. So I had a grenade pouch over here that was tied onto my leg. So I got a stick and started turning it around like this and hooking it and watched the blood stop flowing out of my leg, because it was still smoking, because when shrapnel, you know, when there's an explosion, the metal's red hot, so when it hits your skin, it just sort of burns and keeps on burning. So I was still smoking. And I noticed this leg was bleeding pretty badly, and I had a pouch over here that I had my maps in, and that was also tied on. So I tied that off, and then I decided to straighten out my foot, because I could see the bones, the top of my knee and the bones down here. And I remember thinking that I'm in shock, which is a pretty reasonable assumption, and that if I yank these bones back in line, it'll be easier to set later on and it won't hurt as much, or at least that was my thought. So I leaned over and grabbed a hold of my boot and pulled, and there was a major malfunction. It all came off, and I was holding my boot with my foot in it, and I remember thinking, they can't put this back together now, okay? And that's when I noticed, you might have noticed this hole over here. Metal had gone in and popped the artery over here and crushed this elbow. And the blood was sort of spurting out, and I remember thinking, hey, you bleed to death with that. Then I thought I got to put a tourniquet on there, so I don't know what I got. I got something, wrapped it around and got a tourniquet on and watched as the blood just stopped going, and it was like, then I remember thinking, this is stupid, I ought to pass out. So I passed out. Then there was shooting all around me, and I got up and I sat up and I put my foot here so I wouldn't lose it. I don't know why, I just didn't lose my foot. It just seemed like the thing to do. And there's the bad guy over there, and it made me furious. Because this guy's standing there like this. Sorry, I can't get this arm up. A little rotator cuff a while back. But he's got a rifle on me, and this fool's going to shoot me. And I remember thinking, I'm out of this. What are you shooting me for? He shot me in the kneecap, and that really bothered me. And I apparently tried to crawl away, because then he shot me here in the hip. And that really made me furious, because he shot me twice, and I just totally PO'd about that. So I started getting a grenade out, and he shot me in the back. And I pulled the pin on the grenade and let the spoon fly. And if you know about grenades, once you let the spoon fly, you've got 3 seconds. So when I went like this to throw it, because I'm left-handed, I had another major malfunction. I didn't know that the elbow had been smashed, and the arm kept going back. And then it's like, I got problems, because this thing's going to go boom, and I'm going to get boomed with it. So I reached down and got it in my right hand, and I can't do it anymore because of my shoulder, so I'll do it with my left hand. I backhanded it like this. Well, he had turned to shoot somebody else, and he wasn't looking at me, and it was a good shot. It exploded right behind his head, and it blew his head off, and teach him to shoot me, huh? And I got some shrapnel from that, I got some wounds from that, and Darrell got some more wounds. He was shooting Darrell, that's who he was shooting, because Darrell was still unconscious from the explosion. And then I don't know what all happened. I know that the choppers came in, the airstrikes were coming in, the jungle was exploding around us. People threw me onto a poncho, and I was bleeding very badly. And I kept yelling, "Give me my foot." They gave me the foot, oh my God. You gotta keep your foot with you, you know? And then I remember being on the chopper, and the side of my head was open, and the scar down here was open, and they kept lighting cigarettes for me, but I was lying like this, and there was in a pool of blood, and the blood kept putting the cigarettes out, and I kept cussing at the new kids because they'd tell them if they came through the cigarette light, how they expect to stay alive in this place, and they kept lighting them for me. And then people were chopping on me. Aside from the amputation to my right leg, which they eventually cut off above the nape, I had 26 major wounds. They put 30 pints of blood into me in the first 24 hours, which tells you that as fast as it was going in, it was running out again. And by the time I hit Philadelphia Naval Hospital, I had my 26 major wounds, amoebic dysentery, malaria, a staph infection, a strep infection, and it was from April 3rd until May 15th of 1967 that it was questionable whether I was going to make it, because I was spiking fevers of 104, 105, 106. When you start hitting those temperatures, they start packing your body and your head in ice and dumping alcohol on you. Of course, I remember that. I just remember, geez, it's cold here. And but they kept my, or at least part of my brain from frying. I don't know. There's some people that think that a lot of it fried there someplace. So, but I managed to pull through. So that's how I got hit. And I don't want you to think that that's a special story, because it's not. You can talk to David Wenzel, the former mayor of Scranton. He's missing 2 legs and an arm. His story is slightly different from mine. You can go to the guys in World War II, and they'll tell you slightly different stories, but the main things are there. We were young, we were scared, we were hurt, and pulled through. And so many years later, you can laugh about it.
And this particular day, we were going out to this area to set up our camp. And I was walking down this trail, and luckily there was nobody around with me, because if there was ever anybody, they probably would have been killed. As it happened, I can still remember it even very vividly right now. As I was walking down the trail, I could feel the ground go out beneath my right foot, and I remember hitting something metallic, and the next thing I know I was flat on my back. I never even heard the blast, but I knew that something serious had happened when I was laying flat on the ground looking up at the sky, and I didn't have any feeling in my legs, and I also didn't have any feeling in my left hand. Did you know this was an artificial hand?
There was a person in their company who always read the letters, and if there were anything in it that might tell the enemy something, that was censored out. And it was censored just by cutting it out with scissors or a razor blade or something. And so the boys were supposedly careful about what they said. Now, they could put the place, the country. They could say France, Italy, Iwo Jima, whatever. Oh, I must tell you, my brother was here. Would this be the same group? Mm-hmm. My brother, Ron Clark, was in the Navy. And it's his letter that, that was censored that I want to show you. He said a lot of things that he shouldn't have in that letter. Now, he did it sort of for fun, because he wanted the family to know what censoring meant. And ordinarily, there might be one word in a whole letter. Maybe he put a little bit too much about where they were, maybe a city name. That would be out. The country name, all right, but not the city name. Well, he thought it would be interesting to tell a lot more than that. So this is what he did. He should have had it to show you that day. Now, It says Ronald D. Clark, and then it tells where he was, but I don't know where he was because we weren't allowed to know. We're not having a bad time out here this time. The great topic, or topics, or concerns, the something or other. So you see, when you got through reading that, you didn't know much about him. You didn't know where he was or what he was doing.
While the war was still going on, I saw a rather unusual sight, a building advertising Ford cars and parts. And so I decided to go in and take a look. Now the inside was all cleared out, but in the office I did find some billing and stationery and a pair of ersatz shoes. Now this is the mate. See, towards the end of the war, things are going pretty rough for the Germans, where they couldn't get enough leather for shoes. So here we have wooden soles, wooden heel. We do have some leather for the vamp, and of course the upper here is made of burlap. This is the price of war, because even the Germans themselves found that they had difficulties of getting the items that they needed for everyday life.
Their females are used to, I mean, if you see them, they're all covered in black with the color of abaya. And if you're going shopping downtown, you'll see the guy with his wife or wives. They can have up to 4 wives. And, you know, he'd leave her outside while he went in shopping. It was like the Old West, you know. You leave the horse tied up to the railing outside when you went in, and you'd see these little things around there. So they didn't know what to make of us when we went downtown. We went to a mall, and I thought I had, I had jeans on and a turtleneck. But when I walked in, it was a sock store, too. You know, of all the places to get thrown out of a sock store, this poor guy comes up, "Oh, no, miss, must cover up." You know, he couldn't handle it. So I got thrown out of the store. That's when they started to change the policies. Instead of going down in civilian, everyone went down in military. And that way they couldn't make females leave. It had a couple of guys try to sell me while we were there, because Saudis buy their wives. In fact, one of my soldiers was propositioned by a Saudi soldier. He asked her, he had $60,000 staged, would that be enough to buy her hand in marriage? And she told him no, when he had $100,000 to come back and talk to her. One of my soldiers, one of my male soldiers, was talking to another Saudi male soldier, and he wanted to know, how much my soldier had paid to buy for his wife. And my soldier told him, he said, "Well, we don't buy our wives up front, we pay afterwards."
And I had teaching on my certificate, got assigned to be a teacher. So I had one meeting, and that was the end. I sat there with the Georgia boys, not one of them said a word. They just looked, and you could see pure hate looking out of those eyes. So I told them, let's give this up. So that was the end of that. Anyway, shortly we left, went on Tennessee maneuvers. And one day I was heading up toward a mess truck to get a meal, and I saw one of these Georgia boys that had been in that illiterate school. He was walking across and looking at me, and timed it so he got in the line just ahead of me. He kept turning around and looking at me, but not saying anything. I wondered what's on his mind. We got through, picked up our food, and he was waiting at the end of the line for me. And he says, "I'm going to sit over here." I took that as an invitation. I didn't know what was on his mind, but I went with him, and we sat down by ourselves, finished eating. We're sitting there, and he reached in his pocket, pulled out a letter, asked me if I'd read it to him. So I did. I read the letter, I answered it for him, and in a short time I had half a dozen of those guys. I was reading their mail and writing letters for them and so forth. And with that experience, I knew they accepted me, and I could have put my life in any of their hands.
I had a friend of mine who was a career man, senior master sergeant. I met him a couple of times at the NCO club, and a real nice guy. And asked me, he says, "Hey," he says, "would you like to get out of duty you know, and I was always for that, you know. And I said, sure, what do you want me to do? And he goes, well, he was part of the enlisted man in charge of the air police on the base. And he says, well, he says, I'm responsible for the color guard detail here. And what we do is that when, you know, guys, older soldiers die or young ones come back from Vietnam for burial, the color guard goes and, you know, provides the ceremony for them. And so we practiced, about 2 weeks, you know, people rotating out. A new guy would come in to fill the slot, and, you know, so that you look real nice, real sharp. When you shoot, everybody, you could only hear one gun with the 21-gun salute, you know, and all this. So we would go a lot of places, Alabama, all over the place. We generally take a bus. Sometimes we'd fly to bury these guys. We would call it not too, you know, sympathetically planning them. So we did a lot of planning. On a number of occasions, the hardest was the young kids. And we were young at the time. I think I was 22. But a lot of 18, 19-year-old kids would come back and that we had to bury. You couldn't see them, you know, and it was just a box. But you would see their girlfriends, and that was hard. Hard. And then you had, they'd come up to you, you know, and I remember this one girl, it was her, they were engaged. And I look at it now, and, you know, I mean, I'm sure they still had the pictures of their prom, you know, from the previous year. And she was pretty upset, and I guess we were the closest thing that she had to lash out against, you know. And you know, she'd say stuff like, you know, well, I hope you guys are satisfied, you know. And it wasn't us, you know, we didn't have anything to do with it. But that was real hard, where you, they become real when you see how young.
The only Germans I really flew were those that were the last people in Germany that had any authority. Hitler was already dead, and he passed on the chain of command to Admiral Donitz, and Admiral Donitz designated General Jodl to sign the unconditional surrender of Germany. They got on the airplane, and they were, of course, obviously saddened. They lost the war, and they were the enemy, but yet I didn't know of the excesses they had done in terms of you know, the concentration camps and that sort of thing. But to me, they were just people, and they were involved in this terrible, terrible war. In those days, there weren't any navigational systems in aircraft. You had a map, and you just used dead reckoning. You figured a compass course it would take and to go from A to B. Well, from Lüneburg Heath to Rims was about 2 hours and 45 minutes in the C-47, which cruised about 160, 170. So we started out, and the weather wasn't that good, but I stayed below the clouds so I could fix our position on the map. And I'd drawn a line on the chart, and so I knew where we were, but eventually the weather got so bad that I could not stay in contact with the ground, so I had to pull up through these clouds, went up to about 10,000 feet or so, and still couldn't see the ground. There was no way of knowing what my position was. Just held a steady course and calculated what I thought the wind would be, what effect that would have on us. And after about, I should think 40, 45 minutes of that, the clouds began to break up. And by this time, I knew we were getting close to Rims. And so finally it came down, and I was beneath the clouds again. But I couldn't figure out where we were. I just held onto that heading, but I thought, well, no, in about 20 minutes, Rims should be there somewhere. And it was just about that time that looking at the map and just trying to use all the knowledge I had about dead reckoning and that sort of thing. I fixed our position exactly on course, and then landed a short while after Rems, and I didn't even realize then what a significant day it was, because when I landed and taxied up to the what they call a terminal of sorts, just a few buildings there, here was a great crowd of military people and people from the press. There were cameras clicking, and I thought afterwards, wouldn't it have been something if I had gotten lost?
The sticks in my mind the most was that Christmas. Now, you've got to remember, for 10 years after the war, England was still flat. I mean, it took them that many years to rebuild. We were on ration from 1945, when my husband came over in 52. We were still on ration. So it was like 1953 before we had enough food in the stores to come off the ration. So in the Christmas of 1945, London was still flat. People were living in their air raid shelters in the backyard. And the bells of London had not been heard in 6 years. You couldn't attract attention. You had black curtains over all the windows. At night you couldn't turn the lights on till you put the blackout curtains on your windows, because any speck of light and the German fighters or their bombers would pick up on that and they'd drop bombs on you. So we lived in the darkness. We lived with the blackouts and the bells of London, and there's thousands of churches all through England, and they hadn't rang in 6 years. So on Christmas morning of 1945, I woke up to this glorious sound of bells. Every bell in England was being rung on Christmas Day. If you can imagine the sound of every bell in England, even people with handbells were out there ringing their bells. Finally the war was over and peace had come again, and the bells of England rung for the first time in all those years. It was wonderful. As you can tell, I get emotional. But I don't think I ever heard anything so wonderful in my life. To know that peace was there, Hitler hadn't won, and the bells were still there. And the war ended. Oh boy, what a day that was when the war ended. We had parties like you wouldn't believe. Now, we had no, not the normal party stuff, but we all pulled our rations, and the people next door to us, their name was Britton, of all things. They had Mr. and Mrs. Britton, and they had 10 kids, and they couldn't afford to buy all their rations. Now, you know, with 10 kids, I don't know if you looked in that book how much sugar and that you got, but they didn't have the money to buy all their rations. So they would sell their rations in the black market. We would buy their rations, and they needed the money, we needed the rations. So anyhow, we managed to, everybody pulled whatever they could, and we set up tables in the streets, and boy, we had a dandy party. And anybody that had a piano, they rolled the piano out in the street. My mother played the accordion, and lady down the road had pushed the piano up the street, and the GIs provided a lot of huge tins of fruit cocktail. I mean, just, the restaurant size, and anything else they could bring from their base, and we had a party like you wouldn't.
I still had a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder symptomology left alone, and my wife says, we were living in Harrisburg at the time, and she says, we're going to the wall. Yeah. She says, you're going to be a therapist. Mm-hmm. You'll be dealing with guys with written. Mm-hmm. We're going to the wall. Mm-hmm. You don't want to go to the wall. Mm-hmm. Don't want to go to the wall. And they should have given us money. I don't want to go to this crap now. Man, a miserable woman insisted that we get down there. So it's a hot summer day, so we pack up the kids into the van and we start taking off to the wall.
We get down to Baltimore, and yours truly comes out with this brilliant idea. Hey, why don't we go to Inner Harbor, man? Wouldn't this be fun? We're going to the wall. I don't want to go to the wall. We're going to the wall. I don't want to go to the wall. I'll give you all the plastic, and we can go to Inner Harbor and buy crap all day long. We can shop forever and ever. We're going to the wall. I hate that woman. She is so stubborn. I can't stand her at times, all right? She is miserable. So we get down to D.C., and we're driving around the wall. Hey, there's no parking places. It's 90 degrees. It's hot. Let's go to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. That sounds like we're on the wall. Well, there's no, I can't walk that. We're on the wall. Well, look. There's the Lincoln Monument Memorial. I can't go there. Stop here. What for? Drive up to those horses there. You know, the horses that block the road? Yeah. I drive up. John, he gets out. What? Move those horses. So John moves the horses. She says, drive through. I hate that woman. She is so stubborn. It is incredible. So he put the horses back. We drove through, and we parked right next to the wall. Hey, kids, I'm a Marine. I'm tough. Hardcore, right? Put on your shades. Why do you put on your shades? Don't want anybody to see what's going on in your eyes. Whole way down, I'm going over a list of names in my mind that I'm going to see on this thing. And I'm getting ready because I'm tough. I ain't going to do this crap. Fix her. Miserable. So we go walking down there. And before we get down, I stopped, and there's this little girl there with this book. And I said, August of 66 to April of 67. And she says, that's on panel. And I said, okay. So we started walking down there. And it sort of closed in on me, all these names. And it's like, I can do this. I'm a Marine. I got a tattoo that says so, okay? I'm a Marine. I'm a recon Marine. Got a tattoo over here that says so. Okay, I'm tough. Got down there and started going on line by line by line. And the first name came, and it was like a punch in the stomach. But come on, I'm a jarhead sports fan. I'm a Marine. Let me say, I blink. I might have flooded the tidal basin at that particular point in time, but I didn't blink because I am tough. Went through, and the second name was easier, and the third name was easier, and by the time we got to the 7th, 8th, 10th name, it was real easy. I could handle this stuff. Something cool, huh? Got down there and made a stupid mistake. I looked past the time that I was in Vietnam. And all of a sudden, the name jumps off the wall. Larry Allen Faulkner. No, he was alive when I left. Not Faulkner. He's my little... No, it's not Larry Faulkner. It's got to be 5 other people. It's better be 5 other people. Go on out of that place. Get up there and grab that little girl. Yo, Faulkner, Faulkner, Faulkner. Give me the damn book. Faulkner. Larry Allen Faulkner. Corporal, United States Marine Corps. May 1st, 1967. Cincinnati, Ohio. Oh, God, it's Faulkner. I was ambushed, sports fans. I couldn't hold it. I started bawling. I mean, I just couldn't hold it anymore. I started crying. The old lady sent the kids, told them to go destroy the Washington Monument or something like that. Bring chunks of it home, you know. They didn't care. Get out of here. So she took me behind the wall to the benches back there where she held me, and I bawled, and I bawled, and I bawled, and I cried for Faulkner. And I cried for Barnes, and I cried for Zapata, cried for Doc Brody, cried for 58,000 people I never met. I cried, and I cried. But hey, I'm this tough Marine. I got to pull this crap together, right? You can't go doing this. I can handle this. Okay, let's go get the boys. And behind me, this deep voice goes, you don't have to worry about them kids. We're taking care of them. Compliments of the 101st Airborne. I lost it again because it's 30 years later, 20 years later, we're still covering each other's behinds. Notice how I slipped out of that word. We're still covering each other's behind, and I lost it. And I started bawling again. This time it was for me. This time it was for my leg. This time it was for all the guys that were hurt. This time it was for the innocence, the things that I believed in going over that were no longer there coming back. And finally I did pull it together. It took me about total time of about 45, 50 minutes. I just sat there being held by my wife, crying and crying and crying.